I stared at my phone in disbelief, the screen glowing like it had betrayed me. The message from my mom was short, but it felt like a hammer to my chest. Please don't come. The family wants a drama-free wedding. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, my mind a storm of confusion and hurt. Drama-free. Was that what she thought I was? Drama me. Always the troublemaker, the one who asked too many questions, the one who dared to care too much. And now, at the one moment I thought I would be welcome, I was being erased with a few cold words. I sank into the couch, the leather pressing against my back, grounding me only slightly as memories began to surface. The late nights I had spent helping my siblings with homework, the weekends I gave up to drive my parents to appointments, the endless financial support I had quietly offered over the years, all of it seemed invisible now. Invisible. As if love and effort could be measured and discarded in a single text. My heart ached, but beneath the pain something harder began to form. Anger, not the kind that shouts and breaks things, but a slow, simmering fire, the kind that grows in the quiet corners of your mind. I thought of every dollar I had sent to cover bills they could have handled, every time I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace, every apology I had made for things I didn't even do. And now this, a wedding. My absence requested as if I were a storm threatening the calm. I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg, but none of that felt right. Instead, I typed a single reply, letting the words carry the weight of everything I had held in for years. Great choice. Then you'll be free of my payments too. I didn't hit send immediately. I stared at the message for what felt like hours, weighing the consequences. But deep down, I knew it was the truth, and sometimes truth had a way of stinging more than any lie. The silence afterward was deafening. My phone sat next to me, vibrating occasionally with notifications from friends who had no idea the storm brewing on my side of the screen. I remembered how I had given up vacations, opportunities, and sometimes even basic comforts just to make sure the family I loved could thrive. And now, the family that thrived at my expense wanted me gone from their celebration. The irony was bitter, a taste that lingered at the back of my throat. For a moment, I imagined myself walking into the wedding anyway, a vision of me standing at the edge of the ceremony, watching them smile and dance, pretending I didn't notice the hurt behind every laugh. The thought made me shiver. I realized then that this was bigger than a wedding. This was a boundary, a moment where I had to decide if I would continue being invisible, if I would continue to sacrifice, or if I would finally step back and let the absence speak louder than my presence ever could. The fire in me had shifted. It wasn't about anger anymore, it was about justice. Quiet, personal, and deeply satisfying justice. I wasn't going to ruin their wedding, but I would no longer pour myself into a family that didn't see me. I would reclaim the hours, the money, the love I had given without expectation. And somehow, somewhere, the message would land, not as a confrontation, not as a drama, but as a truth they couldn't ignore. As I set my phone down, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The hurt was still there, a raw ache in my chest, but it had transformed into something sharper, something powerful. I would grieve my place in their lives, yes, but I would also rise above it, armed with the knowledge that sometimes the sweetest revenge wasn't chaos, it was freedom. The days after the message were strange, almost surreal. Life seemed to move around me while I felt frozen in a haze of disbelief. My phone remained on the counter, buzzing occasionally with small talk from distant relatives who had no idea what had happened, no clue that a single text had changed everything. I told myself I would ignore it, that I would act normal, but normal suddenly felt impossible. I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind, the cold efficiency of my words echoing like a drumbeat. Great choice. Then you'll be free of my payments too. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't dramatic, it was truth measured and precise. And yet, as soon as I hit send, a part of me feared the storm I might have unleashed. The fallout began quietly. My mom didn't reply. My siblings sent messages filled with half-hearted concern, asking if I was okay, if I was overreacting. But overreacting wasn't the word. Years of being unseen, unheard, and undervalued had built a quiet resentment inside me that refused to be silenced. I realized that their concern wasn't about my feelings, it was about their comfort. About how my anger or absence might ruin the image of a perfect family. For the first time in years, I let myself stop giving. I stopped sending money without being asked. I didn't volunteer to run errands or fill in gaps they had learned to expect I would cover. Each refusal, each polite but firm, "I can't help with that," felt like a tiny pulse of power. It wasn't malicious, but it was intentional. Every small act of detachment reminded me that I had value outside the roles they had forced me into. I spent nights lying awake, planning subtle ways to reclaim my life. I didn't need to humiliate anyone or shout about injustices. I didn't need a confrontation to make my point. The revenge I envisioned was quiet, deliberate, and entirely within my control. I started small, allowing my savings to stay where they belonged, refusing calls at inconvenient times, politely declining family requests that had once seemed urgent. The family began to notice the absence, though they would never admit it openly. And yet, amidst the anger and the plans, there was grief. I grieved the life I had imagined with them, the closeness I had hoped to maintain, the trust that had been silently eroded over years. Every action of withdrawal was tinged with sadness, a reminder that even the strongest people mourn what they lose, even when it's deserved. The hurt didn't disappear, it transformed into clarity, a sharper understanding of who I was and who I would allow myself to be. I began to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, the times I had been asked to compromise, the moments I had been blamed, the invisible labor that went unappreciated. Each memory strengthened my resolve. I realized that revenge didn't need to be dramatic or loud. It could be as simple as living fully, unapologetically, while letting the family feel the consequences of taking me for granted. As the wedding approached, I felt a mix of detachment and anticipation. I wasn't going to crash the event or create a spectacle. I would let them have their perfect day without me. And yet, I couldn't suppress a quiet satisfaction at the thought of the family struggling in subtle ways, paying bills without my help, managing chaos I had often handled, facing the gaps I left intentionally. There was no gloating, no confrontation, just a calm, steady sense of justice in action. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I was no longer tethered to expectations I hadn't asked for. I wasn't just withdrawing support, I was reclaiming myself. The pain of betrayal still lingered, sharp and jagged, but beneath it, I discovered a new kind of strength. The fire that had burned in my chest after that text had become a steady flame, lighting the path forward, guiding me toward a life where my worth wasn't measured by my sacrifices. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. I had expected tension, maybe even guilt, but what I encountered instead was a strange sense of liberation. I no longer felt like the family's unpaid servant or emotional punching bag. Each day, I woke up with a little more space between who I was and the expectations I had been forced to shoulder. I started small, buying groceries for myself without worrying about anyone else's schedule, taking time off from work without explaining myself, savoring meals in peace instead of shuttling leftovers to someone else. These simple acts felt radical, almost defiant, as if I were reclaiming the hours of my life they had silently borrowed. I noticed the subtle shifts around me. Calls from my mom became less frequent, more guarded, her voice tinged with a nervous politeness that hadn't been there before. My siblings asked for favors, and I found myself responding with polite refusals. Each time I said no, it wasn't bitterness that guided me, but clarity. I was not punishing them. I was simply demonstrating that my absence, my boundaries, and my independence were real, and that their comfort had always depended on my invisible labor. Friends began to notice the change in me. "You seem lighter," one of them said over coffee. "More yourself." I realized they were right. I carried less weight in my shoulders now, the burden of unacknowledged responsibility slowly lifting. And yet I remained acutely aware of the family's reactions, of the subtle ways they flinched when they realized I was no longer at their beck and call. I wasn't vindictive, but the small, quiet impact of my withdrawal felt strangely satisfying. It wasn't just about money or chores. I started making choices that honored myself instead of their expectations. I signed up for a class I had always wanted to take but never had the time for. I spent weekends exploring the city, taking long walks, savoring quiet moments I had long denied myself. Each act was a statement I existed for myself now, and I would no longer define my worth by how much I sacrificed for a family that dismissed me. And yet, even in my newfound freedom, I felt pangs of sorrow. I grieved the lost connection, the family dynamic I had cherished despite its flaws. I remembered birthdays I had celebrated alone in the kitchen, the holidays spent making sure everyone else felt joy while I stayed in the shadows. Those memories were bittersweet, reminders that independence came at a cost. But the cost was worth it. For the first time, I felt a sense of control over my own life, a clarity that had eluded me for years. I also began to notice the subtle consequences of my absence. Bills that I had quietly managed piled up in minor ways, plans that had relied on my support faltered, the family had to confront gaps they had never faced before. I didn't gloat, I didn't orchestrate it. It simply happened. My independence was the mirror that reflected what they had taken for granted, and watching that reflection, I felt no malice, only the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed. by the time the wedding drew near, I had built a life that didn't revolve around anyone else's whims. I wasn't just absent from the celebration, I was present for myself, for my own dreams, my own growth. I had learned that the sweetest revenge wasn't drama or confrontation. It was living fully, unapologetically, while letting those who had dismissed me face the consequences of their own choices. The fire that had once burned with anger had become steady, a light that guided me forward. I could grieve the family I had loved, acknowledge the pain of betrayal, and still move confidently into a future defined by my own terms. The wedding would happen without me, and that was fine, because I had already begun the most important celebration of all, the reclamation of my life, my time, and my worth. The day of the wedding arrived, bright and perfect, the kind of day you could imagine in a movie. I stayed home, far from the glittering halls and carefully orchestrated smiles, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. I didn't feel anger anymore, not sharp and burning. That fire had transformed into something steadier, deeper, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had taken back what was mine, my time, my energy, and my worth. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the world move outside without me. Birds flitted across the sky, indifferent to human drama, and I realized I was finally like them in a way, free, untethered, and unapologetically myself. I didn't need to witness the smiles, the toasts, or the laughter that I would once have felt compelled to join. I had my own life now, one that didn't depend on approval, gratitude, or recognition from people who had taken me for granted. The subtle satisfaction came gradually. I heard through mutual friends about the minor chaos that unfolded without me there, small hiccups in planning, last-minute logistical problems, and the quiet realization that someone who had always been the backbone of the family was absent. I didn't need to gloat or interfere. The truth of my absence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. It was poetic in its simplicity. They had wanted a drama-free wedding, and in their pursuit of perfection, they forgot that I had been holding much of it together all along. I spent the day celebrating my own milestones instead. I went to an art exhibit I had been eager to see, walked through the city streets as snow began to dust the sidewalks, and treated myself to a small dinner at a restaurant I had been meaning to try for months. Each choice, each indulgence, felt like a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of life that had too often been measured in service to others. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to explain my happiness to anyone. There were moments when sadness crept in, fleeting but sharp. I thought of my mother, of the closeness we once had, and the sense of betrayal still stung, but even that pain was tempered by clarity. I understood now that my love for them didn't require self-erasure. I could grieve what was lost and still thrive. I could feel the ache of absence and still bask in the joy of my newfound freedom. That balance, fragile yet powerful, was far more satisfying than any fleeting drama. As night fell, I found myself laughing quietly at a memory, a silly joke I had shared with a cousin years ago, one of those moments that had once been overshadowed by endless responsibilities. I realized that laughter, peace, and choice were the true forms of revenge. They were the proof that I had survived, grown, and taken back control of my life without creating chaos, without malice. My absence had been enough to send a message. My presence in my own life had been enough to reclaim my dignity. And in that quiet, I felt the last threads of resentment unwind. I was free. The family had their wedding, I had my life. I had traded drama for autonomy, tension for calm, invisibility for recognition, if not from them, then from myself. The fire that had once threatened to consume me had become warmth, lighting the way forward, reminding me that sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't shouting or scheming, it's living fully, unapologetically, and beautifully without the people who once took you for granted. I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the night wrap around me. I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need apologies or acknowledgement. I had closure within myself, and as I smiled, savoring the quiet victory, I understood the wedding was theirs, but my life, the real celebration, was mine.